Hello and welcome to Understanding ASD. This is session number 6 and we'll be looking at recognising your strengths on the autism spectrum. And this session is brought to you by the Sheffield Adult Autism and Neurodevelopmental Service, and will be hosted by me, Jonathan, an assistant psychologist. So in today's session, we'll have a brief recap of session number 5 before we move on to the main presentation today, which is recognising your strengths. Towards the end, we'll do a summary of today's session, a small summary of the overall course. Then we have some suggestions about what's next for you. So recapping the last session. The last session we focused on education and employment. So things that we covered included your rights under the Equality Act of 2010, reasonable adjustments, so how a workplace or an educational institution can support you by making some small changes to either the building or the way that you work. And we also talked about disclosing your autism, so telling your manager, your company, or your educational institution about having autism in order to get access to those reasonable adjustments. We spent some time talking about bullying and harassment and what to do if you find yourself in that situation. And we also signposted you to some local services that can help you in employment and education. So let's move on to today's topic, recognising your strengths on the autism spectrum. A lot of the course has been focused on the difficulties that you may face being autistic, and therefore we've also tried to give you some coping strategies to put in place to try and make things easier for you. So today's session is going to be ending on a big positive. We're going to be focusing completely on all the great things that come with being autistic. As for some people, ASD is viewed as a naturally occurring variation. So just a difference in the way that you are and the way that your brain works. Some people think that it's not a disability. However, we do know that it is something that can't be cured or changed. And a lot of the difficulties that you may have faced actually arise from living in a neurotypical majority and an inflexible world. So with the diversity that autism brings, there are also some unique strengths, and that's what we're going to be focusing on in today's presentation. So let's start off with a quote. Everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid. And I think this quote essentially is saying that being autistic means that you learn differently. And therefore, if a lot of people are comparing you to the neurotypical majority, then it's going to make you feel quite bad about yourself. So understanding that you really can't be compared to the neurotypical majority because you and your brain is diverse and is different. And that should be celebrated. So going back to one of the first sessions that we had, we looked at the PENTAD. So this is the 5 different areas of difficulties that you may face due to being on the autistic spectrum. So these 5 areas include social interaction, social communication, flexibility of thought, sensory sensitivities, and emotion regulation. Let's flip that round. Let's think of it more as a pentad of strengths rather than a pentad of difficulties. So starting with social interaction, the strengths of being autistic might mean that you are better in one-to-one situations than groups, and you might be really, really good at interacting with other people in a one-to-one environment. You might prefer doing activities when you're socializing, and that might be a lot more interesting than just hanging out and talking. But you might also prefer to socialize and make friends over the internet. And in doing so, you might have such a wide and diverse range of friendships than if you just made friends first face to face in your local area. In regards to social communication, being on the autistic spectrum means that you might have some really specific interests, and therefore if you learn everything you can about that interest, you'll be able to talk about that in a lot of detail, and therefore your conversations will be a lot more interesting. And also, due to the nature of not liking small talk, it does often mean you probably don't ever just ask about the weather and have meaningless conversations. And a lot of your conversations will be a lot more meaningful to you. In regards to flexibility of thought, when you do find an interest, you might become really, really passionate about it. And you're also really, really principled. So you might have strong opinions on what is right and wrong, and therefore you have a big sense of fairness. In regards to sensory sensitivities, you might notice that you are really, really good at paying attention to detail. And you might also appreciate things a lot more if you are particularly sensitive to your 5 senses. And finally, in regards to emotion regulation, you might find that you are a lot more empathetic to the people around you and can really, really feel others' emotions. And now might be a really good time to consider your own strengths. So what I'd like you to do is turn to page 42 in your workbook and really take some time to answer what you think your strengths are. So please pause the video here in order to answer this question, and then resume the video when you are done. So let's think about the pentad of difficulties for neurotypical people, so people that aren't on the autistic spectrum. In regards to social interaction, neurotypical may seem like they're a bit more of one of the herd, so they accept the norms and potentially don't have a strong individual identity. In regards to social communication, neurotypical people have difficulties because they can be really vague or ambiguous when they're talking, and can often engage in meaningless talk, such as small talk, so often asking about the weather and how you are, without wanting to know specific details. in regard to flexibility of thought. Sometimes neurotypical people can be quite illogical, perhaps have a more limited creativity than their neurodiverse counterparts, and sometimes can lack concentration. And then in regards to sensory sensitivities, compared to neurodiverse people, some neurotypical people might lack an eye for detail or miss things a lot more easily. And then finally, regarding emotion regulation, you might find that neurotypical people often mask their emotions. So even though they may understand their own and other people's emotions better, they're also a lot better at hiding the way that they're feeling. So let's think about the brain and autism. So areas that may have developed differently by having a neurodiverse brain. So starting with the parietal lobe, so that's more towards the back of your head. This is often thought to be slightly overdeveloped in neurodiverse people. So therefore you might find that you have greater logical and visuospatial abilities. So you might be really good at solving puzzles. You might be a really good map reader and have a good sense of direction. You might be pretty good at maths, as well as building things. And then another area that might be sort of more overdeveloped is the temporal lobe, which is slightly towards the bottom of the brain. So this might be an indication as to why people on the autistic spectrum have greater ability in remembering facts. Some people might have a really good visual memory, and some people might be really, really good at visual processing, which gives them that really good eye for detail. But then also in the frontal lobe, the front of the head, there are executive functioning differences. So due to developing differently, potentially, might mean that you have longer attention span for your interests, although you might also have difficulty in changing tasks, which means that you very much focus on one interest at a time. Understanding other people could be a bit harder. You might also be a lot more distractible. You might have difficulty in moderating emotions, so stopping them from getting too high or too low, difficulties with planning and organization, and difficulties with inhibiting behaviors. So different parts of the brain are developed differently. And again, not all of these examples are true for every single autistic person, but it might be interesting to think about whether your strengths are in your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, or your temporal lobe. And it has been suggested that a number of historical figures may have had autism or traits of it. For example, Michelangelo and Albert Einstein. And people with autism are thought to have a different style of thinking. So, for example, might be able to process things visually a lot better and have a really good visual memory. And we also find that a disproportionately large number of individuals with autism work in the sciences. But then on the other side, we also see a really lot of creative people. So, for example, it has been suggested that Michelangelo may have been autistic, and Michelangelo did quite a lot of paintings on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And the reason why they have assumed that Michelangelo may be autistic was because it must take a lot of concentration and a lot of eye to detail to do these magnificent paintings. And I think he did it in quite a short space of time. And then thinking about someone more in the modern day, the artist Stephen Wiltshire is an incredible visual landscape artist, and he has been known to be flown over city landscapes in a helicopter, and then once he gets back to his studio, he's able to draw everything he's seen in fantastic detail just from his memory. And this is just an example of one of his pieces of art, which is the Leadenhall building. If you'd like to see more of his art, you can visit his website. And then thinking about the mathematicians or the sciences. So Alan Turing, who was pretty much the pioneer in artificial intelligence and built a really early prototype of the modern day computer. And his machine, the Turing machine, was really, really important in the World War, and it cracked the Enigma code to ultimately help us defeat Nazi Germany in the war. But there are also some other famous people with autism, and I think it's really, really interesting to hear their quotes and the way that they think about being autistic. So the first one is Temple Grandin. And Temple is a professor and an author over in the United States. And a quote from her is, "What would happen if the autism gene was eliminated from the gene pool? You would have a bunch of people standing around in a cave, chatting and socializing and not getting anything done." Next, we have Susan Boyle, who is a famous singer who initially got famous on the reality show Britain's Got Talent. So a quote from Susan says that Asperger's doesn't define me. It's a condition that I have to live with and work through, but I feel more relieved about myself. People will have a greater understanding of who I am and why I do the things I do. If you can turn it into a positive, then it makes you stronger. And then next up is Jessica Jane Applegate, who is a Paralympian. And she's been quoted to say, "In training and competition, there are very few people who really understand how hard it is for me. I really struggle to cope with people socially. I don't like any changes, and trying to concentrate on more than one thing is difficult. But my coach is very understanding. We have a timetable for everything, so I have a good routine, and we make plans to keep me calm and always have a backup plan so I feel safe." And then finally, we've also got the actress Daryl Hannah, who has been in films such as Kill Bill. So Daryl has said, "I've never been comfortable being at the center of attention. It's always freaked me out." And then we also have a few more people with autism, but more on the male side. So we have Chris Packham, who is a presenter, a naturalist, a photographer, and an author. And he has been quoted to say, "What was apparent to me from quite a young age is that I could become an intense observer and see things which others couldn't in nature. But of course, every organism has its own characteristics and personality." Then there's Anthony Hopkins, who's also an actor and has been in quite a lot of big films, including Silence of the Lambs. And Anthony got his diagnosis a bit later in life and talks about how being autistic has really helped him as an actor. So Anthony has said, I definitely look at people differently. I like to deconstruct, to pull a character apart, to work out what makes them tick. And my view will not be the same as everyone else's. And then we have the musician, Gary Newman. So Gary has said, in things that interest me, I do tend to fixate and take obsession to the extreme. For example, when I was into planes and air display flying, I had to become a qualified examiner. On the whole, I think having Asperger's has been a good thing. It gives me a slightly different view of the world, and I truly believe it helped me get through some hard times. I'd never wish it away. And then finally, we have Guy Martin, who is a motorcycle racer and a presenter on a few TV shows. So Guy has said, the way I look at it is that maybe having that is why I am the way I am. Maybe it's all down to my autistic side. I don't know. If there are any benefits to having it, it's that you just get your head down and get on with things. And I apply that to the way I work. If you've got an awkward job to do at work, you just get your head down until it's sorted. So that's just a few different quotes from different people that have autism and the way that they view it, feel about it, and how they think it's actually benefited them in their lives and careers. So let's think about some different positives. So in regards to memory, you might find that being autistic means that your short-term memory for recent events and instructions might be quite poor. You might find your processing a bit slow and therefore make it quite difficult for you to remember. However, we also find that often people on the autistic spectrum have really good long-term memory, especially for things like facts and statistics, for example, relating things that you know about your special interests. And as we've said before, attention to detail is quite a big strength, and it has been suggested that people with autism process information differently. So this ability is called systemizing. And really it helps people identify patterns in rules and systems. So patterns in music, language, and the weather. And you may find that you can pay great attention to smaller details and notice things that other people don't. And some people on the spectrum also have an ability to hyper-focus. So really focusing in on a particular activity or interest that they have. And if this can be well directed, it can mean that quite a lot of fantastic things can be achieved. And then there's also resilience. So some strengths actually come as a consequence of living and being autistic. So, for example, having to overcome more problems than other people, such as living with sensory sensitivities. In regards to communication, very often autistic people are straight talkers, Communication tends to be around exactly what is being said without any hidden agendas. Autistic people are often good at talking about their interests in detail. It might be better in a one-to-one conversation, over text, or on the internet. And in regards to social interaction, people with autism are often not bogged down by social rules. They can sometimes be a lot less judgmental on other people based on things like people's race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. And sometimes people with autism can feel more comfortable within groups outside of the norm. For example, certain subcultures. And emotionality. So some people with autism can direct their hyper emotionality into creative or other useful pursuits. So if you know that you can become quite upset or even really joyful, then you can channel that into doing something really creative and remarkable. So often things like poetry, art, painting, or drawing. But everyone on the autism spectrum is different, and it may be that you have some really unique strengths that we haven't spoken about yet. So just thinking about some other attributes, people on the autistic spectrum might be really good at problem solving, have a lot of determination, potentially an increased self-awareness, have developed really useful coping strategies for difficulties that they've lived with, might have a good sense of understanding their own triggers, for example, places where there's quite a lot of sensory overload or change, and are able to organize things to get past that. So might be a good time to stop for another discussion point. So what I'd like you to do is consider these questions and then answer them in your workbook in the comment section on page 43. So what I'd like you to think about is, how do you use any of your strengths in your day-to-day life? So these might be ASD related strengths, such as those that we've covered today, or it might be more personal strengths. And think about if there are any barriers to using your strengths. So what stops you from using or doing the things that you're really good at? And how can you overcome that? So I'd like you to pause the video here and spend the next 10 to 15 minutes really considering your strengths. And then resume once you have finished answering your questions. So we've come to the end of the course now. So it might be useful to think about what's next. But before we do that, let's have a summary of the 6 weeks that we have spent in this course together. So in week 1, we started off with a general introduction into what is ASD. There was a gentle introduction into the ASD PENTAD, so the 5 different areas of difficulty. And we spoke about the importance of balancing life stresses with things that you really like to enjoy, as well as what you can do to overcome those stresses. We also looked at your senses. So we looked at the 8 senses, sensory seeking and avoiding behaviours, as well as some self-regulation strategies. We had a session on socialising. So the difficulties that you may face when socialising and interacting with others. We spoke about the model, the social battery. So doing things that charge your battery after you've noticed that it's been used and drained, as well as what you can do to manage social interactions. We also had a session on employment and education. So your rights under the Equality Act of 2010, reasonable adjustments, disclosure of your diagnosis, and local support services. And we had a session on anxiety in autism. So recognizing and understanding your anxiety, thinking about what you already do to manage it, and building your anxiety toolbox. So some coping strategies to put in place for you to deal and manage your anxieties better. And in today's session, the final one, we looked at the PENTAD of STRENGTHS. We looked a little bit into the brain and autism. We looked at recognizing all the different strengths that you may have on the autistic spectrum, as well as thinking about the way that other people might perceive their own autism diagnosis, and went through the quotes with those 6 celebrities. So in regards to what's next for you, there are a number of Sheffield Autistic Society groups that you can get involved with if you did want to meet other people that also had autism. And here are some of the ones that are available at the moment. There is the Adult Asperger group, the Monday Club, which is a monthly social club. There are a variety of activity groups if you've got specific interests, such as photography, snooker, art, yoga and dance. There is also a nightclub called Under the Stars, and this is for people who are on the autistic spectrum, but also or may also have learning disabilities. There's a social group called the A-Team, and these host a whole variety of events, such as going for walks in the Peak District and regular social meetups. They also have an email thread that you can ask to join, and they can send you regular emails about all the events that they are hosting. But if you don't feel quite ready for a social group just yet, but it is something that interests you, there is the No Social Pressure group for adults on the autistic spectrum. And again, this is a group that meets up every 2 weeks on a Saturday afternoon in town. So you can attend until you feel comfortable to speak with someone else, but if you do not want to, then that is completely fine. And for more information and specifics about any of these groups or any of the activities that the Sheffield Autistic Society is hosting, then please visit their website. So it's sheffieldautistic.society.org.uk, and it'll be under activity and the Adult Asperger's group. But if you have any more questions or any queries about anything that you've learned throughout the group, then please contact us at the Sheffield Adult Autistic and Neurodevelopmental Service, and we will be happy to support you in any way that we can. So I'd like to say thank you for joining me throughout these sessions. I really hope that you have enjoyed it, that you've learned some new things about autism and yourself, and you've been able to develop some coping strategies to help deal with any difficulties that you have, as well as finding a way to celebrate the uniqueness and the strengths that you have. So take care of yourself, and I wish you the best. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.